keynote today is by the fabulous Dr. Leonora Risse. So she is a lecturer in economics at RMIT University and a research fellow with the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard University, so we're very lucky to have her, and a research fellow with the Women's Leadership Institute Australia. Her talk today is titled Navigating a Path Towards Gender Equality as a Progressive Journey of Bias Awareness. Come on up.
Thank you, Ginger. Thank you very much to Kim and all of the organisers for bringing us together in this community. If we look around at the people in this room and the people tuning in online at the moment, collectively just think of the wisdom, the talent, the experience, the knowledge, the vision, the passion, and also the purpose. So thank you for bringing together this community. It's an honour to be part of it today. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm in a position of privilege to be able to speak to you today, and we know there are many millions of women around the world who don't have access to an education, don't have a microphone and a voice. And to the degree that we can give those women a voice, but we also acknowledge that we do speak from that position of privilege and are very grateful for that. My slides. Do we have the screen? I think they're on their way. So as Ginger has mentioned, I am sharing with you today basically a way of thinking about gender equality as a journey that we're all on, that society is on. We're all at different stages. And as an economist, part of my work and my passion, my interest, is to look at the existing research, the existing evidence, and to make sense of where it all fits in together. And so what I'm offering you today is a way, like a framework of trying to make sense of all that wealth of knowledge that is growing. And also, as we map that journey towards our ultimate destination, what are the roadblocks? What's getting in the way? We can have an ideal plan of where we want to get to, but we know that road is very rocky. There's a lot of roadblocks in the way, both overt and hidden. It's a pleasure to join you today on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, where I'm usually based in Melbourne, in Victoria. I'm based at RMIT University, and what I'd like to share with you on the screen is a beautiful artwork by one of our Indigenous students, Louise Bloomer. And it's a reference to the beautiful gum trees of the Australian landscape. And when I was sitting down on the table, I actually was looking out when the sunlight was shining through before, and I thought, well, that's actually what we're talking about here, these beautiful leaves. And I've mentioned this artwork today because it's called Leaves of Change. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about change. And we're also talking about the beauty, the wisdom, the spirit that we can learn from those cultures and the people who are currently underrepresented, including, of course, our First Nations women. And it was incredibly moving to hear the amazing personal stories of our Indigenous women this morning. So I'm going to start with a bit more of a positive note. Take stock of things, what a time in history it is to be a woman compared to the many, many decades that we have travelled down as a civilization. I mean, this is what is on the menu for women today. The messaging is quite strong and vivid and uplifting, and it's a utopian, optimistic message that I'm sure we can feel motivated by. These are some of the messages that I think as young girls, as women, we have absorbed, we have been exposed to in life. Girls can do anything, The career woman there, juggling both family and children, looks quite in control, quite satisfied. We have T-shirts to remind us that girls can do anything. We even have perfume to remind us that we have equality these days. So I think for many of us, and again, I don't want to speak on behalf of the many women for whom human rights aren't even written into their country's legislation, but for those of us in countries like Australia, this, I would say, is a dominant message that many young girls are exposed to in life. That promise of equality, that promise of equal opportunity, that promise of merit. So what a time to be a woman. What a time indeed. So this is the reality, as we all know. We know what these images on the screen represent. The grievances, the frustrations, the rage, the sense of injustice that lies behind the many women and men who mobilised. And what this represents, in contrast to that preceding screen, is a promise of equality that didn't deliver. A promise of justice, a promise of respect, a promise of equality of opportunity that has not been fulfilled. And I think for many of us in this room, we're at that moment of realisation. But for many, many women and men, that expectation of equality is very, very real. In their book, Womankind, Dr. Kirsten Ferguson and Catherine Fox, Catherine's book, Stop Fixing Women, might be on some of your bookshelves, they've identified what they call 4 stages of gender awareness that women can personally experience through their life path. And they're summarised in these 4 ways. The first one being one of obliviousness, this expectation that things are going to work out fairly, that meritocracy prevails, that gender will make no difference to a woman's opportunities. And then as we travel through life, we start to realise, hang on, these gender gaps exist. We have a gender pay gap. We don't have as many women in leadership positions. You know, things aren't as equal as I was anticipating. But the messaging from society is one of, well, if that's what the outcome is, it's because of women's choices, their preferences. This is what explains that gender gap, individual actions and decisions. That third stage is one of awakening, that ultimate point of realising it doesn't matter what women do differently, it's the system that has led to these outcomes. And that fourth one is one of, okay, we've got to break down this system. And this is a journey that I think for many of us who read the biographies of some women who have enjoyed success in their life is one that they, I guess, admit to at some point later on in their career. And I think this is a quote by Julia Gillard where she describes how early on in her studies and her career, she wasn't alert to those gender biases. We assume, you know, this is just the culture. I'm in the field of economics, so I know myself as a student, you looked around, I'd never had a female economics lecturer in my whole undergrad and postgraduate degree. I just thought that was economics. And when you hear particular jokes, you're conditioned to laugh, to be part of that culture. You're conditioned not to question it for fear of being disruptive, to suffer repercussions. And it's later when you build solidarity with other women around you that you start to realise, hey, there's something more going on here. And I think quotes like this one by Julia Gillard are kind of testament to that type of process of internal realisation on the part of individual women as well. What I'd like to share with you today is how that process, we've described it as an individual journey. Let's consider how it potentially also applies to wider society and the type of policies and initiatives and laws, for instance, that have been put into place and that follow that kind of starting point of a blindness to systemic structures, and how do we get from one end to the other? I'd like to make the point that it's not just about women absorbing these messages, it's also men and boys who absorb the message that actually girls can do anything these days. It's written into law. You're not allowed to pay women less than men. What are they complaining about? So that message is transmitted to males as well. So as a starting point, I'd like to sort of pick up where Mary's amazing keynote presentation yesterday left off, which is to give credit to the centuries of progress that have been made. And this is in terms of breaking down what we might call overt barriers. So the 1969 equal pay legislation, women being awarded the right to vote and stand for parliament, the historical piece of legislation there, and I'd like to honour Susan Ryan for being a pivotal part of that, the Sex Discrimination Act in Australia, and that contemporary messaging of girls can do anything. I think this is what's left us with this, messaging that, that meritocracy does prevail. So some of the messaging here is one that girls can do anything, and part of that messaging also implies that if there are gender gaps, it's because of deficits in hard work and effort. It's on account of the individual, not the system. So we think about some of the policies the way that policies have shifted over time. What we have seen in more recent decades is this flourishing of initiatives to really help to, reach that final hurdle of closing gender gaps. And here's sort of a summary of some of the potential books or initiatives that you yourself may have participated in, which I would like to emphasise are very well-meaning. I think they do, on the whole, come from a place of sincerely trying to make progress. So things like Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, books such as this one, Girl Boss, which suggests that, the reason for the gender gap is we've just been standing the wrong way all this time. If only that was so easy. And then the onus on women not asking, and so again, it's women at fault. But we can correct this because we can have these confidence training sessions for women, these negotiation training sessions to be more assertive. It's also part of this movement for women to move into traditionally male-dominated roles, which coincidentally happen to be higher paid. And also this notion that women can do a dual shift, so you can be both a successful career woman and juggle your parental and caring responsibilities at the same time through things such as maternity leave exclusively to women. So policies have shifted in focus. So I'm just going to skip that one. Basically, to attempt to make women more like men. And really what we need to add there is a big asterisk because terms and conditions still apply. But the reasoning there is that there is an attempt to converge women to take on the attributes and the skills and the qualities that define what society has defined as successful men, or they've defined success, but in male terms. So it's all about women converging to become more like men. Okay, so the question then lies, are these policies working? And a lot of the time what we do hear is one side of the story, and we don't hear enough about cases where these policies really aren't generating the results that they promise. So here's just a handful of studies from the research that suggest that, there's a big caveat surrounding that type of approach. We know that more women are entering STEM, acquiring those qualifications, but not reaching more senior STEM jobs. Something about the STEM culture is what's getting in the way there. There are studies that show that if you compel or force women to negotiate, that can actually lead to worse negotiation outcomes. So you have to give credit for women being able to read the room and detect whether or not this is an appropriate environment to negotiate. There are some cases here, this was in Norway, where mandated gender quotas actually led to worse firm performance on the basis of the financial indicators that they were using to measure firm success, by the way. But that type of policy outcome doesn't often get a lot of attention. As we know with the work by Michelle Ryan on the glass cliff, women are overrepresented in leadership positions associated with a crisis, which suggests that women are being appointed into leadership not quite on the same terms as men are. And gender gaps also persist. There's also another piece of research that I don't have up on the screen there, but there's also evidence that companies, organisations that proclaim or describe themselves as meritocratic are actually more likely to exhibit favouritism towards men. So there's also that notion that this whole doctrine of meritocratic systems is actually not stacking up against the evidence either. I'd like to share with you quickly a piece of my own research where I thought, okay, this advice to lean in, it's very well-meaning, as I said, and I think for most women in this room, you have received this advice probably at some point of your careers. And as an economist, my approach here is, okay, so what does the evidence say? Has this been rigorously evaluated? So I have data from the Hilda survey, which actually collects some information about people's sense of confidence, putting themselves forward for a challenging situation. So I thought, okay, as a labour market economist, here's a great opportunity to actually see, does this particular personality trait correspond with your workplace outcomes, and are there any gender patterns at play? So I was keen to use the research to kind of investigate, does this advice deliver payoffs? So here's what I found. So here's a graphical illustration of the relationship between this measure of confidence on the horizontal axis and the worker's predicted probability of being promoted in the following year. So the measure of confidence is something that comes from the psychology literature. It's called achievement motivation. It has two dimensions: your hope for success and also your fear of failure, the extent to which you hold yourself back for fear of failing. So on the left panel there of the two graphs, what you can see in the green line is an ongoing positive relationship between level of confidence and predicted probability of promotion among the men. And for the women, you'll see that that relationship flattens out. So it's basically saying it doesn't matter how confident you are as a female, it does not correlate to your job promotion prospects. So there's no evidence here that would be consistent with the advice that leaning in for women is advice that pays off. It will pay off if you're a man, but not for a woman. And there's more. So when I also looked at other personality traits, some of the big five up there being more extroverted, open to experience, your locus of control, the sense by which you feel that your life outcomes are a function of your own doing. Again, I do detect a positive relationship with promotion prospects, but only among men. So men are being rewarded for that type of behaviour, women are not. And another layer of the gender bias here is when we disaggregate according to occupation. So if I just look at managers, what I find is that there is a significant negative relationship between fear of failure and your prospects of being promoted. So there's a penalty. That penalty is larger if you're a male manager rather than a female manager. So it implies that men are being penalised for contravening a gender norm. Men in leadership are not permitted to show weakness and failure. The outcome here is this advice to women to be more confident is going to have little impact if you are not valuing and respecting women in those leadership and decision-making roles in the same way that you are valuing and respecting men. And there's a quote there from previous research by O'Neill and O'Reilly talking about the double bind, that women are expected or encouraged to break this stereotype and assume the characteristics of a male, but when they do, they're penalised for violating that gender role. And a really powerful piece of research that also puts this into context, and if you haven't read it yet, I recommend this paper by Jennifer Burdile and her authors, talking about how workplaces have been designed basically as a site for masculinity contest, rewarding long hours, rewarding prioritising work over family, elevating and rewarding physical strength and stature. And so the rules of the game, by definition, exclude women. And if you take a look at that article, I think for many of us in Australia, we'll realise how applicable that is to the political landscape. The other thing at fault here is that the messaging that's coming out is biased because it's sampled based on the outcome variable. In economics, we would say you're sampling on the dependent variable. It's only the women who have been successful who get to write a book. So all the women who have tried this and lost their job, or being pushed aside, or overlooked for that promotion, they don't get a book contract in the main. One exception here, a fantastic book I came across was by Marissa Orr, which talks about doing things differently, leaning out, but still in a very challenging set of circumstances. So beware of sampling on the outcome variable. So where does that take us if these approaches are not working? And in more recent years, especially in fields like behavioural science, behavioural economics, and psychology, we then find our way sitting in 3-hour diversity training workshops, which are meant to cleanse us of the biases that we've been absorbing for 30, 40, 50 years. It's an ambitious goal. Are these working? Despite the fact that corporate workforces are investing millions of dollars into diversity training workshops, the evidence does not stack up. There are experimental studies that show that if there is not a pre-existing awareness that bias exists in the first place, these interventions can backfire and actually elicit less worker effort because they feel like it doesn't matter how much effort I put in. The outcomes are beyond my control and not just. These initiatives can turn into tick-a-box obligations that end up having very little impact when they miss the core ingredient, which is authenticity. And as we are well aware, when you add that very important intersectional lens, so many of the initiatives that we celebrate as being successful do not work for women who are not part of the majority cohort on the basis of many different dimensions of identity. So summary message there, if you had to sum it up, really we are placing the onus on individuals to change. The onus on women, attempting to fix women, actually carries this extra risk and an extra hazard because it's basically positioning women as being deficient. We have to lift you to reach the standard that men just happen to have. It also is very dangerous for diverting resources, focus, attention away from the system. As an economist, we're really concerned about what we call efficient resource allocation. So the more that you put your effort and your focus and your money towards all these assertiveness training workshops, the less you have to target the system. And then, even beyond the women themselves, this quote here points towards the dangers of compelling, forcing people within the workforce themselves who might not feel like they are actually a victim of existing bias, but are being forced to change. And there's a point there, you know, trying to coerce someone to do X, Y, and Z. Perhaps parents of young children can identify with this. I'll do the opposite just to prove I'm my own person, which is one of the multiple reasons why these diversity training programs can fail. You're putting the onus on that individual to change without context, without intrinsic motivation. Where does that take us? So many of the initiatives I think that you are working on collectively here in this community is taking us to this next stage. And I've just got a handful of examples of programs there. But to sum it up, it's about, instead of, okay, we've made progress with dismantling overt discrimination, we want to be careful that that does not set up blind spots, create that illusion of meritocracy. We've moved to this next stage of trying to equip women to fit into the existing system. Yes, there is a role for things like mentoring to build that sense of community and solidarity, to genuinely expose women to networks, etc., that men have at their disposal. But there are so many caveats around that too. Is that sufficient? And it's expecting individuals to shed ingrained biases, a really, really ambitious call. This third stage shifts the focus onto the system, and one way I would describe that is cleansing the biases and the inequities from the system. So instead of trying to shift women to somehow take on both roles within a career sense and a family sense, we're talking about equipping men to also carry that care responsibility within the family as well. We're talking about shifting gender norms, gender stereotypes, to make it just as acceptable for men to consider going into nursing and caring as it is for women to go into construction and trades. What you'll notice amongst so many government budgets is the focus on getting women into STEM, into construction. Where are the policies that are bringing men into childcare and nursing and aged care and mental health care? Where, by the way, as a labour market economist, are where all the jobs are going to be. It's about approaching it with a very systematic, data-driven, analytical lens. So not placing the onus on individuals to make a subjective evaluation, but analyse the data, run the pay gap audit, put a gender lens over all of your policies, not just the ones that belong to the diversity and inclusion division or HR, but all your policies. In an economic policy sense, we call that gender responsive budgeting or gender mainstreaming. Equality is not constrained to the small 1% of the budget. It's the whole of the budget that has the implication to shift gender equality, or in the absence of a gender lens, to perpetuate existing inequalities. And then beyond that gender lens is one of an intersectional lens. And I've talked very much today in terms of the binary. A lot of the data and the research is based on the binary definition of gender. I'd like to acknowledge the many individuals who identify beyond that. And instilling that intersectional lens right from the beginning is a way for us to embed the principle from the start rather than wait for it to be an afterthought. Okay, so there's the plan, there's the destination. What's getting in the way? Okay, I'm going to put together a few pieces of research which I hope you can use in your armoury when you're out there advocating, strategising, communicating, trying to turn knowledge into action. I found this one of the most compelling pieces of research. It really helped for me to make sense of things when I thought about it in this way. This comes from work by Victor Soho and colleagues. It found this was a study of Australian workplaces. It analysed what is your sense of support for diversity initiatives, diversity defined on the basis of gender, race and disability. And then they also measured what are the other things that really matter to you in life? And they found this correlation. The least support, the negative attitudes towards diversity, were strongest amongst those people who placed a high value on conservatism, so keeping things the way they are, maintaining tradition, and self-enhancement, opportunity for one's own achievement and power. And so this is really the fortress that Mary spoke about yesterday: self-preservation, self-protection. In my own field of economics, we have plenty of material to work with, unfortunately. So here are some of the quotes that come from some recent studies from the US, but the sentiment has been observed, I guess, in Australia as well, it's fair to say. And so what you'll see there are those elements that we've just mentioned on the previous slide. A sense of the threat to your own self-advancement. So gender equality initiatives are seen as taking away opportunities for those who are currently, not disadvantaged by the system. And it's about threatening change without knowing for sure what lies in place of that. And there's another example here of how resistance can manifest itself not just in grievance, why do we have to have affirmative action policies at work? But that third piece of research there on the screen should be one that really, really wakes up our politicians. And I would implore you to refer to it in your future advocacy work. This is based on Australian data. It's conducted by two economists at ANU, Brunig and Zhang, and they looked at household composition of income. And they found that when a woman's share of total household income began to rise above that of her male partners, so she's now bringing in more than 50%, the incidence of domestic violence and emotional abuse rises. So this is an example of a gender norm, a gender identity on the part of men being undermined, being threatened, being disrupted, and the very, very real and disturbing outcomes of that. So at the same time that we are trying to empower women to be more economically secure, to rise up in their own career, we have to be extremely mindful of the fact that we are taking away, in the eyes of some men, a sense of their role, their identity, without them knowing what we are replacing it with or what we are expanding it to. And this can evoke very serious retaliation. I'd like to sum it up here, this process I've described, and this is what I'm very proud to be collaborating on with my colleagues from Harvard, Siri Shalazi and Seva Bishu, who I think are tuning in from the US, so hi to Siri and Seva. We've tried to sum it up here where we've talked about really this journey of just wakening up to the existence of bias, and bias in several ways. The first one was those overt biases, which are hard to argue against. That left us with this sense of girls can do anything, meritocracy prevails. We have to be really, really careful we don't get trapped here and keep referring back to this notion, this illusion of meritocracy, because it creates blind spots to the biases that still persist. It takes us to a place of developing awareness about implicit biases. So in some ways, actually, this denial sort of phase is one of saying, well, I'm aware that gender gaps exist, but I'm not yet aware of implicit biases. So once we discover implicit biases, that can take us to that next stage of, well, how do we conquer these unconscious biases? That's led us to diversity training, but it's putting the onus on individuals to change rather than the system. And so really it's that combination of awareness of overt, implicit and systemic biases that really gets us to that fourth stage. At the same time, underpinning all of this is something perhaps we might want to consider biased against equality. It comes from a position of realising I don't have something obvious to gain through this, from what I can tell, from the perspective of those people who are currently in a position of power and privilege and who perpetuate that system. So I think throughout all of this, we can be working on these structures to break down implicit biases and systemic biases, and we have to be mindful of it activating resistance and be ready for that and be strategic and encompassing of the fact that these are very legitimate and real expressions of resistance. One way to make sense of that at a personal level is also to consider it as a journey at a very individual level, and this is my final sort of contribution here. Some of you might be familiar with this cycle. It's called the grief cycle. It comes from Kubler-Ross. And it's a stylized sequence of emotions that individuals might tend to experience when confronted with grief, but we might think of it as being confronted with shock or change, an external shock that's compelling you to do something you didn't have control over. And it's been stylized to follow this sort of sequence of emotion, one of shock at the beginning, then one of denial, then one of anger, then one of bargaining, trying to negotiate an outcome, one of depression that's characterised by feeling quite paralysed, unable to move on, quite overwhelmed, before arriving at acceptance. What I'd like to suggest to you is when you hear expressions of resistance or backlash or pushback, consider what that might potentially indicate about where that person or that organisation is at their own journey of bias awareness. I've got some examples here. So the first one on the bottom left there, we believe in meritocracy. We choose the best person for the job regardless of gender. That's an expression of denial. There is no problem here. Expressions of anger on the part of men, feeling that affirmative actions is discrimination against them, a sense of injustice. And also on the part of some women who are against quotas or other types of initiatives because they feel like, I don't want this special treatment. It's sabotaging my capacity to be appointed in a meritocratic way. Bargaining, where there's always a but. We support diversity initiatives, but we just don't have the resources at the moment. We want women to succeed, but not at the expense of men. That might be a quote that's familiar to many of you here in Canberra and nationally. So to me, when I hear these expressions, I've actually created this framework in my mind to help to make sense of where that person might be on, at which point that person might be at in their point of their journey. And I think maybe in the conversation later we can talk about, well, how do you support and guide individuals through that journey if we can learn from the psychology literature as well. It also means that when you get to a point of acceptance, you know these people who are now champions for the corporate case, gender equality is really good for business? Yes, great. But if we just waltz up to someone and say that, we're not giving them space to actually go through this journey. And it means we're not actually acknowledging that they might not really be at that point of their own journey of awareness yet, and to give them the possibility that they do still need to travel down a few stages of that acceptance process. So in sum, I would say we need to be aware that biases and norms are deeply insidious, but we have to have our radar up for diversion tactics that I would describe as this whole, women, go and keep busy over there learning how to lean in, be more assertive. And also this diversionary tactic that's used, which is to point towards other values which are really difficult to dispute. Like not many of us here would say, okay, no, we actually don't agree with meritocracy. The point being that we don't have a meritocratic system. But they are used as diversionary tactics. It's about recognising that many women ourselves, that I described at the very early stage, are actually on a journey themselves. We don't just necessarily arrive at this point of sort of feminist realisation. I know myself, I didn't. especially the subjects that I studied, the people I was surrounded by at university, I really sort of stumbled across it later in my own life. I feel like in my own field of economics, and I know I've got some fellow economists here, we talk in words like inequality of opportunity, gender gaps and outcome, unconscious bias. Why don't we have a whole subfield of economics that is about inequality of power? So the system is still covering it up for what it is. And I think we have to be ready for that resistance and backlash, which can come potentially from the perception among some men or among some people in power that this is a zero-sum game for them based on what it is they're aspiring to, and they don't necessarily have a clear indication of what they're going to gain. So this final slide here is about realising that what are men socially conditioned to aspire to? If we think about that final session from yesterday, which was about male parenthood and fatherhood, does society currently reward men for aspiring towards that role, that responsibility? Is it conditioned? Is it set up in a way for them to really gain fulfilment? We've set up a society now where we're telling women you can have a fulfilling parenthood experience and a fulfilling career. You can do both. That same narrative is missing on the part of men. And I think we actually need to go beyond assuming that we're all after this notion of power as well and this fulfilment of traditional masculinity norms. To my mind, I think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and self-fulfilment. Is there a gender pattern there where we condition men to aspire to power as your ultimate fulfilment, and for women, motherhood as your ultimate fulfilment? That's a topic of conversation for another day. And as an economist, we think of incentives. So we think, I've used that word there, are socially conditioned to aspire to. The environment, the messaging that men and women are exposed to makes a difference here. Thank you very much. Should I stay?
Yeah, just stay there. I feel like I want to go have a beer with you and talk to you for a couple of hours. That was incredible. I've got a question here that's come in on the QR code, which I'll go to in just a second. But I wanted to ask you a question first. Every single time I report on sexual harassment, sexual assault, anything that's gendered, I get so many tweets saying, what about men? Men get assaulted too. Men are domestic abuse victims too. And on it goes. And I find it so weird because, like, I'm a thyroid cancer survivor. When I see someone who's got breast cancer, I don't say, what about thyroid cancer? I just feel for that person. So I wonder where you think this comes from, this kind of not all men thing, and what we can do about it.
Well, thanks, Gigi. That's a really deep question. You could have a panel on that too. I know there is academic literature actually on the topic of whataboutery, because it is a phenomenon in and of itself. And look, I don't think I have got all the answers for you today, but it is a legitimate form of resistance and backlash where I think some men are processing that information. They're contextualising it relative to where do I fit in here? And maybe it's about giving them space to, okay, feel that, and then what comes next from that moment, rather than just getting stuck at that point. And that's why I think giving space for that sense that individuals have a capacity to actually travel down a journey might have some practical reality here, because that is an expression of where that individual is at.
Yes. So I forgot you had your lapel.
Yeah.
It's a real minimisation though, and a distraction often in the discussion, which I just find so frustrating.
I would count it as a diversion tactic as well. Yes.
Yeah. I just find it such a frustration and an immaturity. We're going to have 15 minutes of Q&A now. I feel like there will be so many questions from that. So if you want to ask a question, just come up. And if you're online, I have the QR code the chat box open, so smash your questions into there. There is a question here from that's come in from online, and you did address this a little bit, but I think this goes back to this point about people who are heteronormative. Interesting to see the ways in which women are represented in the advice, so cis, heteronormative, dressed in power suits and normatively attractive. What about the rest of us and white? I think this person means and white too. So how would you respond to that?
Yes, and look, in my opening comments, I really wanted to acknowledge that many of us are speaking from a position of privilege where we are talking about gender, but we are talking about other important dimensions of cultural identity, cultural background in various ways. And so, look, I think that the fact that that advice itself is still very narrow is testament to the fact that it is not representative of a realistic path forward.
Okay, who else? Come on up with your questions. Come on, you must be busting. I just had a million things I wanted to ask over here. Are you okay to take the questions and I'll sit down?
I too have that feeling of, okay, so when are we going for dinner? Because there's a lot for us to talk about. And I'm just going to come up with questions on the spot and just have a chat to you. But thank you so much for this body of work, first and foremost, as someone who's working in the space of how do we create systemic change within corporate environments and industries that are increasingly unequal for women and for underrepresented groups. This is a very powerful body of work that I think all of us should be grateful for the amount of effort that you and your colleagues at Harvard have put into this. So thank you, first and foremost, for that. So many things I'd love to deep dive into, but one in particular, there's some research that's come out recently about the discussion around imposter syndrome. And I don't think anyone has arrived at a women's event or a breakfast on International Women's Day where there hasn't been a conversation about imposter syndrome and how hard it is to overcome. And finally, the research is starting to point to the fact that imposter syndrome is yet another proxy for the fact that we are operating in an environment that is not conditioned for us to succeed. And so imposter syndrome is just what feels like actually years of systemic oppression. Is this something that you're looking at in your research? And how are you tackling that with the group that actually is going to struggle with it the most, which is women who have finally felt like imposter syndrome has explained their experience, and then we're going to actually have to ask them to unravel that as well?
Thank you, Nicola. Yes, imposter syndrome is one that I know does fall under the suite of policies that are there to, I guess, legitimise this potential feeling that women are supposed to feel. If we come back to that framework which had fix the women or fix the system, if you find yourself self-diagnosing as someone who experiences imposter syndrome, what is that implying? Is it implying that you need to do something differently? If yes, then it's implying that it's about fixing the women rather than saying, well, what is it about this system that is projecting onto women this sense of inferiority? And there's a whole bunch of analysis that suggests that the notion itself is damaging and diverting us from the system. The Badgett's Corder syndrome actually has some very negative and serious connotations itself. So in my own reflections, I don't want to speak on behalf of my colleagues here because we haven't sort of deep dived into that in particular, but I would be placing it in the same bundle of policies, but it's really instructive for us because it's about recognising what is it in the system that is conditioning women to feel this way and to be told that this is what's expected of you to feel. It's a very insidious part of the diversion tactics, I would say, and the sense of it reinforces your inferiority in the system. That's one way to look at it, and I would be very open to other people who have another perspective, particularly those of you who have felt like you can identify with that feeling yourself, and that is something that you need to process and travel through, I would look at it big picture to think, is this really advancing gender equality by encouraging women to self-diagnose themselves with the syndrome?
So I'm a long time ago from a STEM background, and I have two daughters of both in STEM backgrounds. They're both working in the UK, and I have a son also. And I've noticed in the organisations that they work for that they're tending to have a flatter structure. So rather than have my daughter in particular, or she's just moved, but the company that she was with, they had no positions. They didn't have names for positions. And you may manage one project and someone else may manage another, and you might be working to them. So, and your salary was just negotiated privately, depending upon how useful you'd been. And my view of that is that you don't have this sort of hierarchy of structure. You have more people with more autonomy. And I just wonder if that's a trend you're seeing in Australia, and if there's been any work in if that's more or less productive. I certainly know it suits my girls better. So, yeah.
Great, thank you for sharing that. That might very well be a model that is more progressive. And look, I think I would be looking at what is the outcome, what does the evidence say about are men and women progressing through that industry at the same rate? What are their comparable outcomes in pay, but more holistically, in a sense of a legitimate position that they feel has value and voice. So I think that's something to explore. I don't know for sure if that is something that's happening within STEM in Australia. I think one thing I would caution though is when you talk about flat, meaning sort of like hierarchy is being compressed, I would be cautious about, does that mean flat pay gradient as well? Because once you sort of diffuse and, It
certainly doesn't seem that way.
Okay.
No, I think they're remunerated pretty much on how productive they've been and how much, they've contributed towards the company.
Well, that would be
that's my experience.
Yeah, I think some of the examples that have been shared here today and yesterday about models of flexibility in the form of job sharing, I think are incredibly promising for us to go ahead with. So if this sort of flat structure is an example of that more genuinely flexible work arrangement, that could be along a similar line of progress that hopefully we will see in some progressive industries and organisations in Australia as well. Thank you.
Leonora, thank you. Margaret Jolly from Gender Institute at ANU. I'm just really interested in how you're putting together the personal and the systemic. And having kind of been exposed to Kubler-Ross's 7 stages of grieving, which of course is now a play done by Indigenous people, having experienced that first when my mother was dying of cancer, I'm really worried about how, this idea of stages, which is a description of some possible experiences, became prescriptive. And so I think that it's important in conceptualising a journey, I think it's important to think about hope. And I'm really but I feel that in some ways we've got to do more to think about the resistance back. Now, in terms of diversity as a diversion tactic, I can't help but absolutely agree, because I think that there's so much of this stuff that is predicated on ideas of the deficit of the people who are being oppressed. I'm really inspired by Sarah Ahmed's brilliant kind of incisive analysis of what it means to be a woman of colour in those diversity and inclusion sort of contexts. And I really worry that sometimes the diversity inclusion stuff, even though it's seeming to espouse the intersectional, can actually dilute some of the specificities of being Indigenous, being a woman, being hetero, non-binary, etc. So, I mean, I suppose the sense that I have is that if it's not about, kind of curing the deficit of women or of, people of colour, whatever, surely if these things are systemic and it's a system that's creating the kind of personal, the sense that we might have an imposter syndrome, surely you've got to start by attacking the people with power. And so, I think that insofar as, we should be looking at ways to institutionalise that kind of attack on people with privilege. So from an economist's point of view, how do we do that?
Yes, thank you for raising the fact that intersectionality here is not something you can sort of just pop down over the top of this. You could look at that final slide where we talked about the different stages of awareness, and I've presented it on the basis of gender. You could do that on the basis of race, on the basis of sexual orientation, on the basis of ability, on the basis of cultural and linguistic background, independent, just to acknowledge that is in and of itself an issue that deserves attention, rather than it sort of being subsumed under gender. So we're very mindful of that. Our colleagues, we've talked a lot about how do we position this in a way that really doesn't create, I guess, maybe even hierarchy within those layers of identity. We're extremely mindful of that. We'd like it to be perceived, ideally, more as a sort of a structure or a principle that can be applied in the particular context of interest as well. When we describe the journey of the individual, we're also very mindful not to attempt to speak on behalf of women and not to focus on the women's experience, but to instead focus on the messaging that the individual has received as a function of the system. So it's not so much about, oh, here's how I feel, and try to articulate what it is that women are feeling. That's way and above beyond our right to do that. It's more about, okay, if some women are expressing this, what does that tell us about the system, the environment that they're in? That's our reason for introducing that personal journey. And actually, that was actually the spark, the idea for this. It came from reading that journey and from hearing many individual women's expression of that and figuring out how do we make sense of that? How does that actually sit within all this policy work as well? So we still have a lot to go with that. Okay, I'll pause there. Thank you.
We're just about out of time, or maybe just take one more. We've got 24 seconds. So which one of you wants to be fast? Melanie? Quick.
I was going to say a quick comment and a question. Maybe there won't be time to answer the question, but I guess I just wanted to say that for me, the elephant in the room here is capitalism, and particularly neoliberal capitalism. And that I think, if we had the 8 billionaires that own more of the half of the world's wealth, if they were women and people of colour and queer and had disabilities, that would still not be progress. And my question separate to that was just whether you had looked at industries like non-profit industry where it's mostly women, and where it's not women competing against men, whether there were different findings, I guess.
Yes, look, this won't I'll just say quickly, this won't typify all organisations or all cultures. I think what we're responding to is sort of like that dominant rhetoric that you will find in government policy statements and women's budget statements about the types of policies that are being endorsed, not to the exclusion of the other, for instance, the not-for-profit sector or community-based organisations that can have a different approach. And the whole point about it being underpinned by the forces of capitalism, yes.
Thank you, Leonora. I think we'll have to leave it there. I'm sorry, Astrid. Thank you so much. That was just so compelling. Leonora is around, so grab her in the lunch break, grab her in the tea breaks if you want to pick up the conversation further. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ginger.
Thank you. That was amazing. And thanks for making it here from Queensland as well. It's so dodgy with COVID. You just don't know what's going to happen next. Okay, we are now going to watch a very short video from Michelle Ryan. So this is under the Share the Load theme. Michelle Ryan is a professor of social and organisational psychology and the incoming director of the Global Institute of Women's Leadership at the Australian National University. Let's watch.
Hi, I'd like to talk about some of our research looking at the choices that women make within their careers and how context constrains and shapes those choices. I'd like to focus on our work on sacrifice here, really looking at the sorts of sacrifices women might make for their careers. I'd like to start us off really looking at some of the background to how people talk about workplace gender inequality, both in terms of academic discourse, but also how lay people talk about it as well. I think what's really interesting is historically there's been a lot of discussion around the external barriers that contribute to workplace gender inequality, including how stereotypes and norms might shape decisions, how the division of labour affects inequalities, and also how legislation and law contribute as well. But what I find really interesting is that more recently there's been a shift in this sort of discourse and discussion from these external barriers to a closer look at women's choices. And I think this has been a shift over the last 15 or so years. I think really emblematic of this shift is the work that was done and on the opt-out revolution. It was a phrase that was coined in 2003, looking at the large number of women, highly successful women, that were leaving the workplace. The New York Times Magazine did an article where they interviewed all of these women, and here are a couple of quotes. "I don't want to be famous. I don't want to conquer the world. I don't want that kind of life." And another woman said, "I don't want to be on the fast track. Some people define that as success. I don't." And a third woman, "I was no longer willing to work as hard for a prize that I was learning I did not really want." I think what's really interesting about this focus and this shift, I guess, from external barriers to choice is that it gives women agency. It asks them what they want and it looks at the decisions that they make. But I also think there's a risk that such a focus on women's choices also tends to, I guess, dismiss ongoing external barriers that may exist. So what I'd really like to focus on is this idea of sacrifice, this idea that women might not want to give up things and that they might want more of a work-life balance. Certainly, when we look at the research more generally, this comes up as a very common explanation to explain the persistence of workplace gender inequality. This idea that women are more likely to make sacrifices for their family, they might not seek promotion, they might work part-time, they might take longer maternity leaves, whereas men are more likely to make sacrifices for their work. They might extend work hours, travel for work, and so on. And I think these sorts of explanations really are used to justify why women are underrepresented in particular roles, such as leadership roles, why they might get paid less, why their careers might not progress as fast as their male colleagues. So I think when we talk about this sacrifice, I think it's not enough just to ask whether women do or do not sacrifice, but we really need to ask the question, why might women might not be making the sacrifices for work? What sort of cost-benefit analysis are they doing when they're making this decision? And I think importantly, how might organisational experiences shape and constrain these decisions? I'd like to present two quick studies that start to explore this idea that has recently been published in the Journal of Applied Social Psychology. So in our first study, we looked at surgeons. In the UK, surgery is very male-dominated. Less than 10% of surgeons, surgical consultants are women. We had a large sample of over 1,300 surgeons, including 36% women. And we asked them about their experiences and about their willingness to sacrifice. Now, what the data showed us is that women experienced things quite differently from their male counterparts. So they encountered more gender discrimination, and they also reported that they felt like they fit in less with surgeons who had made it. So when we asked them to look at their role models, to successful people within the surgical career, they said that they felt like they didn't belong as much, that they didn't fit in, that they weren't similar. And both of these experiences of gender discrimination and a lack of fit led women to feel like they would be less likely to succeed as surgeons. And this in turn predicted the fact that women were actually less willing to sacrifice for work. So here it's not only important that, yes, women are less willing to sacrifice, but it is in part explained by their encounters in the workplace of gender discrimination and the lack of role models. And this idea really that why would you make sacrifices if you don't expect you're going to succeed? We replicated this study with a couple of little tweaks in a different environment. We looked at veterinary surgeons. So this is a really interesting group, actually, because while the veterinary profession is currently on its way to becoming very female-dominated, over 80% of veterinary students are female, it still has a culture of male dominance within the profession. So here we looked at over 1,200 vets, 65% of them were women. And again, we found that women were more likely to experience gender discrimination. They were less likely to feel like they fit in with successful vets who had made it. And this in turn was directly related to a slightly different variable here, but related to them feeling that they had were less likely to have benefits if they did make sacrifices. And this reduction in feeling like that they might have benefits from sacrifice was in turn very predictive of their willingness to sacrifice. So women were less likely to sacrifice for work because they felt like there weren't benefits there. They felt there weren't benefits because of gender discrimination and a lack of role models. So taken together, I think these two studies then suggest that while women are less willing to make sacrifices for their career, we can explain it in part because of their experiences of gender discrimination, their lack of role models, and how these things reduce their perceived benefits of sacrifice. So the implications then are that women's choices are absolutely constrained by the context and their experiences at work. It's important then, I think, practically to think about how organisations can create contexts that actually encourage women's careers, that encourage them to make sacrifices because they feel like their sacrifices will be worth it. And if we take the idea of lean in, you know, this, I guess, empowerment message that women should sort of lean into their careers and make these sacrifices, I think we also need to ensure that organisations provide women something to lean towards as well. Okay, thanks very much.